had done.
The issue was not whether Lorena Bobbitt did what her husband claimed she did. The facts about the act were evident.
She pulled on my groin area twice, I think. I felt a couple of jerks, and then after that, she just cut it off.
The 7-woman, 5-man jury heard the story of how Mrs. Bobbit ran from their apartment with Mr. Bobbitt's penis in her hand, and how the organ was reattached in a 9.5-hour operation. But the heart of the testimony came as the defense tried to prove that Lorena Bobbitt was justified in doing what she did. A string of witnesses told stories of physical and verbal abuse of Lorena by John.
He kicked me. He told me that I told you not to cry. And he slapped me on my face. He pulled my hair. And he squeezed my face.
I again witnessed extensive bruising over the top and sides of Ms. Bobbitt's skull, into her hairline and face line, and down her neck and shoulders again as before. I did not, however, notice that all through the rest of her body as before.
Her depression was very noticeable. Her sadness was very noticeable, and occasionally when she was doing my nails, she would burst into tears.
Lorena Bobbitt's most poignant testimony came when she described a night of forced anal sex.
I was with my stomach down, and he did it. He have anal sex.
Did he ask you if he could?
No.
Did you give him permission to?
No.
Their next-door neighbor testified to what he called sounds of painful sex coming from the Bobbitts' apartment the night of the incident.
I hear people having sex every once in a while. These weren't the same.
How did they differ?
They differed a lot of times, other than headboard hitting the wall. It wasn't rhythmic. This woman was screaming. I mean, she would scream out every few seconds, and then it just continued.
Both prosecutors and defense lawyers called psychologists and psychiatrists to testify to the state of Mrs. Bobbitt's mental health.
She had an acute deterioration of her mental state at that time and became psychotic.
That's the basis of the defense, that Lorena Bobbitt, who says she was raped that night, had an irresistible impulse to slice off her husband's penis. The prosecution called Virginia state psychologists who disputed that testimony.
We're talking about an impulse that someone has, but they cannot stop themselves from doing it because a disease of the mind impairs their ability to control themselves. In this case, the impulse is clear, it's anger, and it's to cut off her husband's penis. But there's nothing here indicating that she can't control herself.
The lawyers took 2 hours to summarize their cases.
He was drunk. He wanted to have sex. She didn't. That's her right. He forced her to have sex. She was angry, and she retaliated against him. But, you know, folks, we don't live in a society that is governed by revenge. We don't live in a society in which whoever has the biggest knife wins.
It was probably one of the most bizarre acts that has happened in this country in a long, long time. Everything about this case, it is so unique. What she did, going out of that house with a Game Boy, a penis in the hand, everything about this case is crazy and bizarre. This is a classic case of irresistible impulse.
Irresistible impulse, of course, is at the heart of this case, and whether the jury believed that Lorena Bobbitt had an irresistible impulse to do what she did. We've just been told we're going to have the verdict from the foreperson of this jury in about 5 minutes, by the way, Lou, and so that's sort of a speeding up of the timetable of action here in this Manassas, Virginia courtroom. Lou?
All right, John, what do you make of the questions asked by the jury of the judge today? There were 3 of them.
Well, there were. One was, could they see the written reports of the psychiatrists who talked to Lorena Bobbitt? That apparently related to the irresistible impulse part of the defense. The second question and the third question that they just asked also directly related to irresistible impulse. What was going on in Lorena Bobbitt's mind? If the jurors believed that she had what in Virginia law is known as an irresistible impulse to do what she did, that would be the insanity defense. And if the jurors believed that she was insane when she did what she did, then they have the right to find her not guilty. some outside analysts have been saying they expect the jury to do this, but of course we won't know for another 3 or 4 minutes till the jurors come back into the courtroom and make that announcement for themselves. Greta, what do you make of these 3 questions?
Well, I think one thing is it shows that this is a very smart jury who listened to the evidence. It shows they're thinking. It shows that they're actually deliberating. The fact that they picked up the distinction between how the psychiatrist viewed irresistible impulse and how the state of Virginia defines it, I think is significant. It shows that they weren't just sitting there with their minds wandering. This is a smart jury, and they want to do the right thing.
And John, under Virginia rules, we have been unable to see one critical element of this trial, and that is the jury itself. And you asked the defense attorney earlier today about what he saw in the juror's eyes when he was arguing his case. What did you learn from that?
Well, Blair Howard said that he was looking at the jury. He did what I would call a throw everything you've got at the jury final summation argument. He talked about many different elements of the case, and in fact I think we now can hear what Blair Howard said in that interview just a couple of hours ago.
It appeared to me that they were very attentive to all the arguments that were made by the lawyers. I think at all times...
Please bring the jury down.
Tell him I can do something. Standing with Lorena Bobbitt there in the courtroom, James Lowe, her initial lawyer in this case. Blair Howard, the man who did most of the cross-examining and examining of witnesses, is seated at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. James Lowe will be standing with her, it appears, for the verdict from the jury, as they are now marched into the room by the court sheriff's deputies and bailiffs. You can't see them, but you can tell that they're in the room because the attorneys in Virginia, under, I guess, a Virginia state code of courtesy, stand up when jurors enter the room. So we'll have the verdict now in a matter of seconds.
You may have a seat if you would, please, ladies and gentlemen.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict in the case?
Yes.
Is this your unanimous verdict?
Yes.
Would the defendant please stand? In the case of Commonwealth of Virginia versus Lorena Bobbitt, criminal number 33821, we, the jury, find the defendant, Lorena Bobbitt, not guilty of malicious wounding as charged in the indictment by reason of insanity. Signed, Clay S. Kokalis, foreperson.
Does either counsel wish for the jury to be posed? No, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me thank you for the time and effort that you put into this matter. It has taken 2 weeks. At this time, I'll ask all parties to remain in the courtroom and be quiet. It has taken 2 weeks. Thank you for your time and effort. At this time, you're excused. You may go with the bailiff. Counsel, are there any motions at this time?
Yes, sir. Pursuant to the jury's verdict, Your Honor, I ask that she be committed to the Commissioner of Mental Health.
Your Honor, please, I have a memorandum I'd like to pass up, if I may, in regard to that motion.
I'll hear your oral argument at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please, 19.2-182.2 has a constitutional defect which is, I think, of a very serious nature. As the statute requires a mandatory commitment for an observation period of a minimum of 45 days. That commitment requirement deprives Your Honor of the capacity to make an informed decision based upon the materials
into her hairline and face line and down her neck and shoulders again as before. I did not, however, notice it all through the rest of her body as before.
Her depression was very noticeable. Her sadness was very noticeable, and occasionally when she was doing my nails, she would burst into tears.
Lorena Bobbitt's most poignant testimony came when she described a night of forced anal sex.
I was with my stomach down, and he did it.
Man jury heard the story of how Mrs. Bobbit ran from their apartment with Mr. Bobbitt's penis in her hand, and how the organ was reattached in a 9.5-hour operation. But the heart of the testimony came as the defense tried to prove that Lorena Bobbitt was justified in doing what she did. A string of witnesses told stories of physical...
He had done.
The issue was not whether Lorena Bobbitt did what her husband claimed she did. The facts about the act were evident.
She pulled on my groin area twice, I think. I felt a couple of jerks, and then after that, she just cut it off.
The 7-woman, 5-on verbal abuse of Lorena by John.
He kicked me. He told me that I told you not to cry. And he slapped me on my face. He pulled my hair, and he squeezed my face.
I again witnessed extensive bruising over the top and sides of Ms. Bobbitt's skull,